started. Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on this next month's EMV Shift. My name is Amy Toner, and as lead of education at NATSO, it's my pleasure to bring this topic to NATSO members. Today, I'm here with Linda Toth, Managing Director at Conexxus. She's going to talk about the financial aspects of the shift. And then we also have Dan Whitkemper, Director of North America Payment at Gilbarco, and he's going to answer some questions we've gotten from members. Everyone's lines are muted, but we definitely want you to send in your questions, so be sure to drop them into the Q&A, and we'll answer them during the second part of the webinar. Now I'm going to hand it over to you, Linda.
Great, thanks, Amy. Welcome, everybody. I'm really happy to be here to talk to you about EMV today. I am Managing Director for Conexxus, and Conexxus is a nonprofit member association dedicated to the development of standards, education, and technical advocacy for the convenience and retail fuels industry. Before I begin, I just want to warn you, my camera is being a little bit intermittent, so if my video goes off, I haven't disappeared, it's just my camera is acting up. All right, so let's get started. Most of you know about the liability shift dates. Back in 2015 is when the liability shift happened for everything except the automated fuel dispensers, or AFDs. So April 16th or 17th, depending on the card brand, just a month away, the outdoor liability shift will happen. And that is a 3.5-year deferment from the original date, but there will be no more deferments. So what does liability shift mean? Well, it simply means that merchants are now on the hook for additional fraud that occurs. So when we talk about fraud, what we're really talking about are two types of fraud. The first is lost and stolen. And this is when somebody else has your card. Either you've left it behind when you've paid somebody, perhaps somebody stole it. It could have been, you lost your wallet, somebody stole your purse, etc. So this accounts for about 10% of the fraud at AFDs. The other type of fraud is counterfeit fraud, and this is about 90% of the fraud out there. So it's the big guy. And this is where you still have your card in your wallet, but somebody has taken your payment credentials and created a new card and is using that even though you still have your card in your wallet. So it's really important that we understand what type of fraud you're looking at. As an industry, we're looking at about $450 million a year in counterfeit fraud at the AFDs, and this is across the industry. But each of you should be able to get your individual fraud numbers. So today you're not seeing anything except lost and stolen, but that amount of fraud that's happening at your sites that's counterfeit is available to you. If you are branded, reach out to your brands and they should be able to help you get those numbers. If you're not branded, reach out to your processor or your acquirer. If you're large enough, you may have a card brand rep that can help you do that, but you'll want to know what your fraud numbers are so that you can plan accordingly to mitigate your risk. So it's important to understand where we are as an industry on EMV preparedness. And one of the things that Conexxus has done is fielded a bunch of surveys over the course of about 16 months. We did 3 surveys. The interesting thing that happened is in the middle of that spring 2020 survey, the pandemic hit. So literally we had answers before the pandemic, we had answers after the pandemic, and then of course we got a 6-month delay. So we went ahead and fielded that 3rd survey. This chart right here, I know it's a little bit of an eye chart, but I think it's important to look at the kinds of people that responded to the survey and the stores that they represent. So as you may know, about 60% of the stores in the US are single store operators. And so it makes total sense that the majority of the respondents to the surveys were the small guys, 1 to 10 stores. But they represented very few stores in the overall store count. The large guys, the 500 plus stores, represent the most stores. So that makes sense, but it's important to keep that in mind as we're looking through the survey data, that some things by respondent may differ than things by the store count. And those categories on the left-hand side are the NACS store count codes that are used in the state of the industry, or the SOI data. And just for comparison, I put out on that last column what the store count is for data that goes into the SOI. So I think overall, the response across the 3 surveys was pretty consistent. The small guys made up the majority of the answers, and the large guys make up the majority of the store count. So one of the questions, oh, and before I move on to that, this is published. It's public facing. You can find it at conexxus.org/EMV. You can find details of all three of the surveys if you're interested. So one of the questions that we asked was, what percentage of your sites have contact EMV currently working at the dispenser? And the interesting thing about this is if we look at that rightmost column, the blue line is the most recent data. The gray line is the earliest data, or the bars, I should say. And you can see that the people that said they're 100% deployed is relatively flat at about 15%. And there might be some good reasons for this. We're not guaranteed that the same people answered the survey every time. It was anonymous. So, some folks may have dropped out. I think more than likely it's also a fact that the small guys made up the majority of the respondents. And if you think about it, they're sort of binary, right? If they've got one store, they're either 0% or 100%. So the small guys are much more likely to be able to be at 100%. So that remains relatively flat. But the really interesting thing about this is when we look at those who said they had no sites deployed, this decreased dramatically over time. And that's a good thing because it means people have started, whether they have one site in beta testing or whether they're well on their way to being completely rolled out. And that's evidenced by those middle factors where the percentages are somewhere between 25 and 100%. Those have increased over time. So it just simply means that we're really starting to see some significant sites out there. The next question we asked that I want to share with you is, what percentage of your sites do you expect to have EMV working outside by April 2021? And I think it's kind of interesting that, 61% of the respondents said they would probably be ready by April 2021, whereas by store count, it was only 10%. And that over 50% of the stores said they were going to be, maybe halfway through their rollout. And I think in general, those that have 50 stores or less tend to be further along in the rollout. Larger chain size, they have complications from M&A. As more and more mergers and acquisitions have happened in the industry, the complexity of supporting multiple brands of equipment and the complexity of managing a larger rollout come into play here. But if you take into account 15% were already rolled out at 100%, and then 61% of the remaining 85%, we're really looking at somewhere around 70% of the total chains think they might be fully rolled out by the EMV liability shift date. Now, the number of stores that represents is obviously much lower, but I think this compares relatively favorable to what we're hearing from the card brands, which, depending on which brand you listen to, is somewhere between 35 and 50% of the transactions out there are EMV, chip on chip. So clearly we're making some progress. We're not there yet, and we're not going to be there by, the April deadline, but we are making some progress. We also asked, when do you expect to be 100% deployed? And the first half of 2021, both by respondents and store count, was pretty significant that it would happen the first half of 2021. So even though we may not make April, it's very possible we'll be there by June. It is interesting that 53% by store count said 2023. And I think this is, again, it's the complexities of the larger chains are just showing up here. So when we look at the challenges for EMV, there's numerous challenges, and I think Dan will probably go into a few of these in detail. It's a costly endeavor. It's costly, and your ROI on this is not significant. It allows you to continue to accept payments, but it is very important that you complete it, and we'll talk about the risks that you face if you don't. But you've got to replace a lot of different equipment and or just replace software. All of those components, be it the dispenser, whether you do a retrofit kit or install new ones. You've got site systems that you need to worry about. You potentially have to run new wiring. And if you do that, potentially, you're breaking concrete, and now the EPA comes into place. You may need to get building permits. You certainly got to pay technicians, and there's the cost of the downtime that your sites are down and that you can't do sales. And expect longer downtimes when you upgrade to EMV than you're used to for some of your other upgrades. We also know that there are some issues with technician availability. Solutions still aren't available for everything. You have to have end-to-end solutions in the payment ecosystem. So each of those components needs to have the software in place. I've talked to a couple merchants recently that said for some of their various combinations of equipment, it could be another year till they see solutions. So that's still a problem. And then we know petro is complex, right? There's a lot of unique things that happens in petroleum in our payments. So that adds to things. And then the US payment system is very complex. I'm often asked, well, Europe has been doing this for years. Canada has rolled out. What's the big deal? Well, our payment system is much more complex. In certain parts of Europe, they don't even do pay at the pump. It's all prepay inside. If you think about the number of terminals that we have in the US, we have more terminals than there are Canadians in Canada. So if you think about, just the sheer number of sites and terminals that we need to upgrade, it's pretty significant. And then we slapped COVID-19 on top of all of this. And so all of those things just were really exaggerated and exacerbated. Technicians during the lockdown at the height of the pandemic were only doing pump down situations. Hardware, some hardware had backlogs to it. I think we've seen a lot of that ease up, but we're seeing certain components that are still on lead times. So, the 6 months that we got for an extension due to COVID-19 were generally very welcome and needed. I will say that it's unfortunate that those 6 months came when they did. If you think about it, the majority of the 6 months has been over the holiday period where typically retail does no upgrades. And then if you think about our folks in the northern climates, they're just finally climbing out from ice and snow. So outdoor installations were on hold. So 6 months was definitely welcome, but it probably wasn't enough time for a lot of people. So you may be wondering, well, okay, I'm not going to make it. What are the consequences? So the first, of course, like we talked about, are chargebacks for any counterfeit fraud. Today, you're eating the lost and stolen. On April 16th or 17th, now you're going to start getting the chargebacks for counterfeit fraud. And just because you're not seeing fraud today doesn't mean that you're not going to see fraud in the future. I've talked to some merchants that saw zero counterfeit fraud. And again, this was from getting their data from the card brands. And then a ring of scammers came through and literally they had hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of counterfeit fraud overnight. So just because you don't see it, don't think that it's not going to happen to you. And we know that as the pool of people gets smaller, the card thieves or the card scam people are not just going to close shop on April, a month from now. They're going to find new ways to do their criminal activity, and they're going to target people that aren't EMV enabled. So, you're going to be a target for fraud, and you're also going to be a target for skimming because you're still doing the mag stripe. If you are branded, you may incur monthly fees from your brand. There's been several that have announced they're going to start charging monthly fees for every month that you're not EMV compliant. You also may be missing out on other incentives. If you're unbranded, it doesn't mean that you get away with it because you may be incurring fees from processors. That's not uncommon and it's not unheard of in the history of sort of payments. And when we look back at things like PCI compliance, et cetera, there were other fees. Also, there's the consumer avoidance factor. Consumers are used to paying with their chip card, and they're used to seeking out those locations that are EMV enabled because they think it's more secure. And I apologize if you can hear my dogs barking in the background. I think UPS must have dropped something off. And finally, you need to really think about risk mitigation. And I think Dan may touch on some of this, but if you're not going to make the deadline, I would encourage you to identify those high-risk sites and get those prioritized. And then you need to think about how to dial down the fraud at your sites. If you're branded and your brand allows it, you may choose to send some people inside and not do pay at the pump. You can implement, fraud monitoring programs. Some of the card brands or your processor may have that. I will caution, the more that you dial that down, the more people you're sending inside, and obviously not letting people pay at the pump takes convenience out of a convenience store. So those are all things to think about. I've just gone a real high level overview of this. If you have further questions, go ahead and type them in, and you can also contact me offline. And that's
Thanks,
it.
Linda. All right, now we're going to transition to more of a Q&A. And like I said at the beginning, we have Dan Kemper and Danny Seals with Gilbarco on. I definitely want to make sure you guys know that Gilbarco is a longtime member of NATSO and a Chairman Circle member, which is the highest level. And we appreciate everything that you guys do for us. So thanks for being here.
Sure, thanks, Amy.
Yeah. All right. So we have some questions that people have already submitted to me, which I'm going to ask, and then you can drop in more questions in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll fling them at the panelists. So the first one is, what do our members need to know as a fuel retailer about the shift, such as downgraded transactions, monthly fees assessed, and no signatures?
Sure. And Amy, there's a few things that come to mind. Maybe I'll start with, as Linda mentioned previous, when it comes to the shift, the liability shift, it's important that the members know that the date's not going to change, right? So Visa's first announced this EMV plan 10 years ago, and they made several adjustments in good faith to give the banks, the equipment suppliers, merchants an opportunity to adopt EMV at the pump. So the date's going to be the date. What I would mention is, speaking of date changes, there was an announcement that was made this past Tuesday, I believe it was on the 16th, that caught the attention of many folks, and I just wanted to clarify what that announcement was.
Yep.
Both Visa and MasterCard, they announced that they were going to delay the swipe fee increases, and that was going to change from April of 2021 to April of 2022.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had several inquiries where folks were thinking, oh, that was the EMV date change, and it is not. So if your members saw that, and I just want to make sure that they understand that had nothing to do with the EMV liability shift date. That date is still April 16th or 17th of this year. And then maybe I'd just continue a bit to say, if your retailers haven't already made a plan, or they haven't already adopted EMV at the forecourt, it's still not too late, at forecourts or your backcourts. The important thing is, don't delay any further and get a plan in place so you can get updated and get updated ahead of that counterfeit fraud hitting your site.
Okay. Okay, so what is the process for upgrading your fuel dispenser?
Sure, great question. So there's a few steps in the process. The information I'm about to provide here, it's going to apply to your members where they have Gilbarco fuel dispensers or even another brand of fuel dispensers as well. There's basically 3 steps to keep in mind. Number 1 is you need to contact your service technician company. Have them come out and do a site survey of your equipment. They can give you then direction on which dispensers need to be updated or can be updated, and which dispensers need to be replaced. Additionally, they're going to be able to provide information on the type of equipment that has to be added to your site in order to process a forecourt EMV transaction, like high-speed communication between your point of sale solution and the forecourt or backcourt payment terminals, and additional networking devices that may be necessary as well, routers, switches, and depending on the brand that you fly, you may also be required to have a managed network service provider device, or an MNSP device, which basically is a more secure version of a router, if you will. So that was number 1. Number 2 is get your equipment order in, because, and this is so important because you can't get in the installation queue until you've got that equipment order in place, right? So that's a key to kicking this whole thing off. And number 3 is schedule your forecourt EMV hardware and software updates. And there's a bit of a dance here, because remember, this is likely not just to include your dispenser hardware. It's going to include POS software, sometimes POS hardware, and the networking devices I spoke about. So it is a project, if you will. But lean on your equipment providers, service technicians, use them as resources to help steer you in the right direction in terms of what needs to happen here. And they can also be helpful in determining if there's any permits that need to be pulled as you're doing this equipment upgrade. And if so, I would caution, don't delay in getting those permits lined up.
Okay.
So in summary, real quick here, the 3 steps are: do a site survey, place your equipment order, and then schedule the upgrade.
Okay. I'm going to jump to a question.
Okay.
We know that the industry won't be at 100% next month. Thoughts on fraud mitigation techniques or tools to use while waiting to get all sites enabled?
Yeah, so for those folks that won't have EMV enabled, on April 16th or 17th of next month,
Mhm.
there are still some things that folks can do. One is being aware, awareness of what's going on at your sites. Have your store employees be on the lookout for large vehicles. Sometimes it's maybe multiple large vehicles that are blocking a dispenser, so it's harder to see what's going on from inside. And if that vehicle's parked there for longer than what would be a typical fueling transaction, you might be more aware of what's going on. Maybe even approach and just make sure that everything's on the up and up. Another thing that they can look for is if someone's dipping multiple cards, that's typically a good indication there could be fraud going on.
Okay. Darren, we have Darren Schulte here with NATSO. I'm going to put you on the spot. Was there anything else you have along those lines?
So for us, on the backcourt, we're going to be further along before we're EMV compliant out there, mainly because of POS systems that we have. And if you have the labor capability, or if you start seeing a lot of fraud, I do a quick cost analysis. If you could get at least maybe someone to, regularly go out there and check on the drivers. 30 years ago, we'd actually send runners out to the pumps, to verify license plates and things like that. That's essentially since gone away. But if you're looking at $200, $300, $400 a day in fraud claims, specifically on the diesel side, you might want to rethink that idea about, again, sending people out there just to greet, even if it's just to greet someone and say, hey, how you're doing. Most fraud will go down when people get noticed. I'm not saying that's going to eliminate everything, but just like greeting customers when they come through the door, likelihood of them shoplifting goes down once you greet them. So that would be one of the simple ways. Again, it's not super inexpensive to do that, but you might want to consider that.
Okay. And then what about this other question? Can Gilbarco talk about the Avalanche wireless access system?
Sure. So there are multiple ways to connect the inside of the store, the point of sale or forecourt solution, or forecourt controller solution, to the payment solutions on your either forecourts or backcourts. One is Cat5 connections. There's other solutions that allow you to reuse the 2-wire that's in the ground today, and both Gilbarco and Wayne offer solutions for those. And then there's an Avalanche wireless solution as well. And we are a partner with Avalanche. If you're interested in that and you have Gilbarco dispensers, contact your Gilbarco distributor, and they can get you set up with a quote on what that would look like. But we do support Avalanche as well.
Are there operators out there today that have EMV compliant pumps to run through Comdata, Trendar, point of sale systems?
Amy, EMV software updates, they happen so frequently that I'd recommend that any operator that has a specific POS contact that POS vendor, and at least that way they can get the most recent information from them. But regarding your question on Comdata,
yep,
and EMV, I know that Comdata has released a version of EMV for their card lock POS on some of the networks they support. And they were planning to have a delivery this month to support the truck stop POS on both the Fiserv and NBS networks.
Okay. Okay, today we focus on the EMV liability shift. Can you share with us what our members have to look forward to?
Sure. So with regards to, everyone seems to be, accepting that, EMV is, basically, shortly going to become table stakes. However, as we mentioned earlier, EMV is about preventing counterfeit card usage rather. What EMV doesn't do is encrypt any cardholder data. So what can handle that encryption is a solution called point-to-point encryption. So what point-to-point does is it encrypts data from the card swipe all the way to the payment processor, where it's then decrypted. So the technology that is very effective in preventing the store from being breached by what we'd say are traditional hacking methods, where malware is placed on the point of sale or on a home office of a customer's network, where it potentially then at that point in time has access to lots of card data from many stores. So the next big thing coming in security is going to be point-to-point encryption.
Okay. I know that Gilbarco has a lot of resources on the EMV shift. Can you talk about some of them? I know you have a guide, right?
We do. And on the Gilbarco.com website, there's a menuing system. If you go up to the menu and click on forecourt payment solutions, there's an EMV guide that's basically it's a guide that will take a retailer through all the various steps that I spoke about previous, considerations that they need to have, the types of dispensers they may have, and what's available in terms of either a kit upgrade, a payment kit upgrade, or a new dispenser update.
Okay. And you guys have a retrofit, is that right?
We do. So those retrofit kits are available for dispensers going back to 1990. So we support them on our Advantage, the Encore 300 and 500, and obviously our 700 platform.
What kind of questions do you get about that usually? I think, Danny, want to answer those? Do you get a lot of questions on the retrofits?
So there are some considerations to think about with retrofit kits on the pump's age, right? There's some technologies that, you know, as we've gone through the years, the pump electronics and hydraulics and things like that have changed on the dispensers. But we do have the kits, like Dan said, that'll go back to the Advantage series. Some of the questions we get there is the size of the screen that's available. The screen is limited to our 5.7 color screen on the Advantage retrofit kits. And I think that's probably the biggest questions is, you know, do I do a retrofit or do I do a dispenser replacement? And really it comes down to, you know, what kind of technologies are you seeing from the operation of that equipment and the age, and being able to make that economic model work for you.
Okay. All right. Do we have any more questions from anybody? Our question hotline is open. Oh, I think we got one. Thoughts on the cost benefit of contactless at the dispensers?
Yeah, so I'll say that of the kits, the retrofit kits that we ship and our new dispensers, they're roughly about an 89% attach rate for contactless. So the benefit is going to be that if you get it done at the point of installation, you don't have to have a tech come back out later and do that upgrade at a later date with a new trip charge and such. And it's becoming so commonplace, and so many cards have the contactless capability built into them. Yep. That it really is the way to pay as we go forward here.
And Amy, I would add to that, if you're branded, a number of the brands are actually doing incentives for you to upgrade to EMV, you know, cost incentives. And most of those are only valid if you use the contactless option. So if you want to take advantage of that free money, you'll want to install contactless.
Sure.
Yeah, I know, Darren, you've been talking a lot about investing in contactless. So certainly what we've been preaching from NATSO, right?
Absolutely. To Linda's point, if there's monies available, you definitely need to take advantage of it.
All right, any more questions? While we're seeing if we have any more questions, Dan, do you want to share your contact information so people can get a hold of you?
Sure, happy to. So you can reach me on LinkedIn. You can also reach me at my work email address. That's dan.whitkemper. Let's see, my spelling of the name is in the title here, but it's WITKEMPER@Gilbarco.com.
Great. Well, I think if we don't have any more questions, we definitely have a lot of resources that NATSO has. I'll be sure to send them out to the group. We have the podcast with Dan where we grilled him again and asked him some surprise questions, which are my favorite. And we have a lot of articles on NATSO's. And we really thank all of you for joining us today. I know it's an important topic and we want to cover it as many ways as we can at NATSO. All right, thanks guys.
Bye.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Bye.
Bye.